Hazem Seeker. Let's get a roundup of the top stories now. Aljazeera has been to a refugee camp inside Syria, close to the border with Turkey, where internally displaced people have constructed makeshift camps. People there say they feel relatively safe, but they're having to fend for themselves, and many of the children are frightened about the future. Former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic says he should be praised for his peace efforts during the Balkans War. Karadzic has begun his defense at his war crimes trial in The Hague. He's accused of masterminding the killing of 8,000 Muslim boys and men in Srebrenica in 1995. US President Barack Obama and his Republican challenger Mitt Romney are getting ready for their second presidential debate. The two men will face off at the Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York, just a few hours from now. The UK has announced that Gary McKinnon will not be extradited to the United States. He had admitted to hacking US government computers, but says he was looking for evidence of UFOs. The extradition was blocked as it's feared McKinnon, who has Asperger's syndrome, may try to kill himself.
After careful consideration of all of the relevant material, I have concluded that Mr. McKinnon's extradition would give rise to such a high risk of him ending his life that a decision to extradite would be incompatible with Mr. McKinnon's human rights. I have therefore withdrawn the extradition order against Mr. McKinnon. It will now be for the Director of Public Prosecutions to decide whether Mr. McKinnon has a case to answer in a UK court.
The European Union has imposed new sanctions on Iranian institutions, including some on the central bank. China says dialogue, not sanctions, are the solution to the nuclear issue. There's anger in the UK after a Reuters investigation discovered that coffee giant Starbucks has paid no tax in the country since 2009. Last year, the firm reported a loss in Britain. It's been said that Starbucks did so by paying fees to other parts of its global businesses. British doctors say the Pakistani girl shot by the Taliban last week has a good chance of a decent recovery. 14-year-old Malala Yousafzai was flown to the British city of Birmingham on Monday. She is being treated at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. The trauma unit there specialises in treating gunshot wounds to the head. And those are the headlines. The news continues after Inside Story.
The European Union imposes tough new sanctions against Iran, tightening restrictions on banking, shipping and trade. The stated aim to force Iran into dialogue about its nuclear activities. But are sanctions an effective way to open diplomatic channels? And are they really justified? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. They're among the toughest yet. The EU is ramping up pressure on Iran, imposing more sanctions on the banking, shipping and energy sectors. It's drawn up quite a list, taking in 2 top ministry, a host of state-run oil and gas companies, and several banks, including the Central Bank of Iran. It also specifies the Minister of Energy. The West has long accused Tehran of developing nuclear weapons, a claim Iran has consistently denied. Iran's been the target of sanctions for more than 2 decades now, but it continues to remain defiant and publicly insists the restrictions are not harming the economy. The latest EU measures are likely to put more pressure on what is a faltering economy, and the hard facts suggest that Iran is suffering. Iran's oil exports have dropped by about 1 million barrels a day in the past 12 months. In hard cash, that's a 60% drop in revenue. Inflation is running somewhere between 20 and 25%, and it's hitting Iran's currency hard. The rial has lost 40% of its value against the dollar in recent weeks. So are sanctions a legitimate means of bringing about diplomacy? For more on this, I'm joined by our 3 guests. From Tehran, Sadegh Zibakalam, a professor of political science at Tehran University and a specialist on Iran's foreign policy. From Dubai, Middlebrook, CEO of Geopoliticity, an advisory consulting firm specializing in political and economic intelligence. He was also a former economic advisor to the UK, European Union, and the World Bank. And from Washington, D.C., Mann Leverett, CEO of Strategic Energy and Global Analysis, a political risk consultancy. She was a former U.S. diplomat and an official at both the White House and the State Department. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in Tehran with Sadegh Zibakalam. What impact is this latest round of sanctions likely to have?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I don't think that it will change anything because many Iranian leaders, as well as lots of Iranians, really regard the sanctions as nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, but rather they regard this as a tackle, as an onslaught, if you like, by the United States and by the West against Iran's revolutionary and radical stance internationally. Many Iranians, including Iranian leaders, they believe that if it were not for the nuclear program, the West would have picked up on something else in order to put pressure on it. As simple as that.
Well, we'll get into the issue of what exactly are the sanctions supposed to achieve a little bit later, but Mann Leverett in Washington, D.C., firstly, what impact do you think that this new round could have?
The new round certainly could and is intended to increase hardship for ordinary Iranians. That is the intent of sanctions. That has been the intent of sanctions since they were imposed on Iran, as was the intent of sanctions when they have been imposed on other governments and other systems, like the sanctions that were imposed for over a decade on Iraq. The intent is to impose additional hardship, extreme hardship on ordinary people, with the idea that they will then rise up and overthrow their government and get rid of a system that Washington doesn't like. That is the intent of sanctions. And what the impact will be is they will probably increase hardship for ordinary Iranians. They will increase transaction costs. They will make doing business harder. But the reality is what we have seen come back from Iran, the response from the Islamic Republic of Iran, has been, yes, hardship for people, but also an increased ability to rely on indigenous production, indigenous capacity. When we first started imposing sanctions on Iran after the revolution in 1979, Iran was barely able to produce a bullet for its military. Today, Iran has a pretty much indigenous, self-producing military-industrial complex. That's what Iran does. They're able to turn internally to an educated, well-fed population that can produce indigenous industry, and that's likely to continue to be the trend.
Well, the stated aim of the sanctions, according to those who've drawn them up, particularly at the height of them or the initial throw of them some 6 years ago, was we are talking about smart sanctions. We are aiming them specifically at the authorities and at the machinery that keeps the authorities in place, not at the ordinary people, contrary to what we've just heard there from Mann Leverett. Peter Middlebrook, what is your view? Are sanctions directed at that stated aim of bringing Iran to the negotiating table?
I think to some extent they probably are. The reality is that most sanctions end up having perverse effects, I think, as has been previously commented upon. I mean, sanctions upon North Korea for many, many years have not led to any particular solution. You look at the sanctions which occurred in South Africa, for example, including the arms sanctions, led in fact to the proliferation of arms production. So the perverse effects are the adaptation which takes place within the Iranian economy as a result of it, number one. Number two, these are European Union sanctions. They certainly affect 27 member states and companies that are trading. But there's a much bigger world out there, and Iran, as we know, of course, has recently been establishing stronger links with other countries in Asia and South America. So again, it's about the perverse effects. I don't think singularly they will have the impact that perhaps politicians are looking for.
Well, let's always talk about the politicians and about the aims of changing authorities, but What about those 75 million ordinary Iranians? Let's just hear the voices of a few of them.
You simply cannot buy anything. Whatever you buy today will get more expensive tomorrow. If you buy it tomorrow, it will get more expensive the next day.
I think the people have become more strong. The sanctions haven't had any effect because people think the enemy is being destroyed from within.
You see, they want to put more pressure on Iranian nation. But when there is a pressure, it will be on the people, not on anyone else.
Well, Sadegh Zibakalam, we hear there the voices of some ordinary people in Tehran, but what we've seen as well as a consequence of the economic hardship is a reaction, a public reaction in the streets. There have been demonstrations against the fall of the currency, against shortage of food, etc., etc. Do you think that this, in the end, is an intended aim of sanctions to create internal unrest? Do those who draft the sanctions say no?
Really, the people were angry. I quite admit there's no denying that actually there are economic hardships. No one can tell you that, no, everything is rosy, everything is fantastic. No, it isn't like that. People are suffering. But the point is that, including those who actually came out on the streets about 2 weeks ago, they are blaming government mismanagement rather than the sanctions. Very interesting distinctions. Now, I cannot tell you that whether it is really as a sanctions that the suffering we have, or is it as a result of government mismanagement? But the point I'm trying to make is that many Iranians, rightly or wrongly, they believe that it's Ahmadinejad's mismanagement, it's the government mismanagement, rather the sanctions.
Here we, Mann Leverett, that's an interesting distinction that we heard there from Sadegh Zibakalam, the point that people see the leadership as being incompetent or not fulfilling its functions, rather than getting angered at the imposition of sanctions, leading perhaps to that consequence. What's your view? Would you agree with that type of distinction?
Well, certainly something you see emphasized here in Washington. First is this misleading idea that sanctions are targeted. That is only put out there with these kind of designation of certain individuals for travel bans, for example. But the sanctions are in no way targeted. When you sanction the Central Bank of Iran, when you say that SWIFT can't handle banking transactions into and out of Iran, you are covering transactions that people need to buy food and medicine. That's what it covers. There's no targeting about it. So it's very misleading to buy into that line. But it is certainly something that is propagated here in Washington quite frequently. That, plus the intent to actually target ordinary people, which is what Hillary Clinton set out when she first spoke about imposing sanctions on Iran during the campaign here back in 2008. She said she would push for, and she has gotten, crippling sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was the intent from the beginning of the administration, and that's what they've gotten. What she's now come to say is that on top of her ability to get and impose crippling sanctions on Iran, that somehow this has nothing to do with Washington. This is all about mismanagement inside Iran. And I'm sure there are several people, if not a lot of people, in Iran who agree with that, who do not like President Ahmadinejad and would like to see his fortunes suffer. But the reality is that Iran is a strong, robust country with a huge export base in terms of its hydrocarbon economy, but also an industrial manufacturing base. This country would be doing just fine, if not extremely well, if it were not for crippling sanctions that the United States has intentionally led an international campaign to impose.
Well, Peter Middlebrook, we're hearing here a suggestion almost that sanctions are not a means in themselves, that they could, in fact, be a prelude to enforcing regime change, and that, in fact, is the agenda that lies behind this. What's your view of that particular opinion?
My general view, I think if these sanctions were an eventual graduation to wider UN Security Council sanctions, I think that would be something else. I mean, there's lots of questions really being asked of countries in the Middle East at the moment, and this is an unpopular saying of whether you're on the right or wrong side of history. I think the most important thing is whether the sanctions are just or unjust. Ultimately, they will not be a targeted effect. They will affect the entire economy, and that includes not necessarily just the leaders, but girls and boys, people who actually depend on, the day-to-day abilities for their parents to be able to earn incomes to pay for schooling and so forth. So they cannot be targeted in that sense. There's a wider question here, though, I think, if you look at what's happened in Iraq, the devastation, I know having been working there very much the last 3 years, the devastation caused as a result of what happened over the course of the last 15 years. I think there's wider questions which both sides of the equation need to discuss.
Well, Hilary Mann Leverett, I see you nodding at that particular question. Would you like to add to that?
Yes, I mean, it's quite remarkable. It is little commented upon. But over 1 million Iraqis were killed as the result of U.S.-led international sanctions on the Saddam Hussein government in the 1990s. And here at the time, when our Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was asked, is the price worth it for 1 million Iraqis, half of whom were children, to be killed for U.S. policy to punish, if not overthrow, the government of Saddam Hussein? She said publicly on television here, yes, it's hard, but we think the price is worth it. And worth it for what? To disarm Saddam Hussein of weapons he did not have, which gets back to the supposed basis of these sanctions, which is a nuclear weapons program which the Islamic Republic does not have. Both the U.S. intelligence agencies and even the Israeli intelligence agencies say that the Islamic Republic of Iran does not have a weapons program. So it's almost as if we're going through this bad movie once again, as we did on Iraq, trying to do it to Iran. The problem is not only the moral cost of the number of Iranians who will suffer, but as an American and someone who is involved in strategic thinking and political risk here in the United States, I'm very concerned about what this is going to do to the United States, our position in the Middle East, and our position in terms of the global economy. We cannot afford yet again to make a mistake as we did in Iraq and to make it on a scale exponentially larger with the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is a very serious mistake, and the United States will pay, I'm afraid.
Well, amidst all of this confusion, and despite the imposition of sanctions against Iran, U.S. exports to Iran are actually on the rise by around 1/3. During the first 8 months of this year, the value of U.S. exports rose from around $150 million to almost $200 million. And much of that was wheat and other grains, accounting for almost $19 million. Contrast that with corn sales of just $21 million in 2011, and sales of dairy products more than doubled from almost $8 million to just over $20 million. Sadegh Zibakalam in Tehran, there seems to be almost a sense of cynicism about this. The imposition of sanctions, forcing Iran to come to the negotiating table, says the US and other Western allies. At the same time, the US importing or putting in foodstuffs into the Iranian economy. Can you explain the sense of confusion that is happening here?
Well, really, to American leaders who must explain this confusion. I think that the American leaders, the American government, whether the Republican or Democrat, they really don't know what from Iran. What do they want to do with the Islamic Republic of Iran? Is it a regime change? Is it to coerce Iran to give in to the American, to the Western demand? Is it a regime change? You see, we hear different voices from the United States, and that different voices have been going on since the Islamic Revolution 32 years ago, when Iran did not have any nuclear program. As I told you, it's really not the question of nuclear program. If it were not for the nuclear program, United States would have done something else to have a go at Iran. And for this reason, Iranians are not prepared, would not like to blame the Islamic regime for the pressure that United States is putting on Iran, because many ordinary Iranians also believe that nuclear program, Iran's nuclear program is an excuse by the United States.
Well, Peter Middlebrook, this is an important point, that if, in fact, there is a veiled attempt to effect regime change here, it might be having exactly the opposite effect, creating a certain degree of popular anger about outside interference in Iran's internal affairs, and also solidifying the position of the authorities within Iran, who politically could not be seen as bowing down to outside demands, could they?
I think that's probably correct. I mean, monitoring the impact of sanctions is notoriously difficult, number one. Number two, if you kind of look at the potential impact on them, there's a real risk here that Iran ends up, as part of this process, being increasingly isolated. And one of the media risks of that is, of course, is that it's hard for Iranians themselves to know precisely what the international viewpoint may be. Again, this has nothing to do, in my view, whether something is right or wrong. The question is whether a specific policy is bad for your country. And we know very well the cost of sanctions at the moment, even though there are lots of workarounds, when they hit the central bank, and when they hit both the capital account and the current account, that it starts to affect individuals. And so, long-term effect of sanctions can be profound, they can be isolationist, and as we've seen in Iraq, the outcome of many years of international foreign policy in Iraq has not been positive necessarily from a regional stability perspective.
Well, Hilary Mann Leverett, you did bring up this point a little bit earlier, but I think it must be pointed out. We talk about the impact of sanctions, we talk about what their intentions are, but do we talk enough about why they are there in the first place? Do you think that there is justification for the imposition of sanctions in the first place, regardless of what impact they might have?
Yeah, and let me take it in two pieces. One is that the impact of sanctions, I think, is having an effect, and it is intended to cripple the population in Iran as it was intended to cripple the population in Iraq. The problem, though, is like in Iraq, no matter how devastating sanctions are to a population, and they were overwhelmingly devastating in Iraq, we have that precedent, they still do not lead. A precedent in history is against this. They do not lead to populations rising up and overthrowing their governments. What they do is they demonstrate to others who want to have even more forceful, coercive military action that, look, sanctions didn't work. We checked that box. Sanctions didn't work. We have to take even more military, more aggressive action against this recalcitrant state that is challenging particularly U.S. policies and preferences. That is exactly what happened with Iraq, and that is unfortunately the road we're on to with Iran. Now, the underlying basis here is not just the nuclear program. The sanctions in the United States and around the world have been passed in the European Union and through the Security Council on the nuclear issue, but also on questions about Iran's human rights behavior and its supposed sponsorship of terrorism. There is a whole litany of bases that we have these sanctions for. If, for some reason, there were some kind of progress, some sort of advance in nuclear talks, which I doubt would happen, but even if they were, the United States could not lift its sanctions for two reasons. One, most of the sanctions have been done legislatively, so whatever the president wants to do, it doesn't matter. Congress here will have a veto. And two, even if there were progress on the nuclear issue, that would do nothing to address the United States' so-called concerns about Iran's human rights and support of so-called terrorism. So this is just we call here in the United States a hamster running on the wheel. There's no way Iran gets out of this, just like there was no way Iraq could get out from under its sanctions. And unfortunately, particularly again, I stress, as an American strategist, my concern is this path leads us to another unnecessary war in the Middle East that will not only kill people, but will dramatically degrade America's standing, hurt the United States, and hurt our allies in the long term that rely on a credible and strong America.
Well, Peter Middlebrook, to pick up on the stated cause or the stated reason for these sanctions, we know that in Iran, for example, it's importing gasoline at the moment simply because it does not have the infrastructure or indeed the economic power at the moment to refine enough gasoline for the automobiles within its own country. This raises questions about a country that can have the ability to be able to refine uranium to the 20% in which it can be used in nuclear weapons. This whole issue of nuclear capacity, is this an excuse, do you believe? Is there a genuine fear among those who impose sanctions that Iran is somehow producing a weaponized nuclear program?
I think there's no doubt that there's a perception that Iran presents an existential threat to Israel. Whether it does or not is, I think, kind of an open discussion. There's certainly no proof to that to date. I think the wider question for me is even not about that. It's whether the policies which are being put in place actually lead to wider peace and stability and regional economic integration. And Iran is a country with the Caspian Basin to the north that again could have been not just increasingly wealthy, which it is, it's a very significant player, the second largest economy within the Middle East itself, but it could be actively engaged in part of overcoming some of the more structural problems that we do face in the Middle East. High levels of unemployment and other issues, the Arab Spring kind of really pushed to one side. So again, existential or not, the realities are that the impact of a policy can often be perverse, and it certainly doesn't necessarily hit the people who might be the target of such an intervention.
Well, Sadegh Zibakalam, we heard their reference to the claims that Iran poses some existential threat to others in the region, in particular Israel. How is that accusation viewed by Iranians, coming as it does as yet another basis for these sanctions to be implied?
Everyone knows that Iran is not basically militarily capable of destroying the state of Israel, despite the fact that Iranian leaders keep saying that the state of Israel must be destroyed. Just imagine that at the end of the day, Iran has produced one or two nuclear devices. What can it do with one or two devices against the state of Israel, which we know that has 300 to 400 nuclear warheads? So I think these existential threats, which the Israeli claim, really, again, this has been an excuse to put pressure on Iran. And again, it appears that some Western leaders, some American leaders are hoping that by putting pressure through the sanctions against Iran, the people would rise against the Islamic regime. They haven't. When they rose against, when they came out on the street because of the sanctions, they did not blame the Ayatollah Khamenei. They did not blame the Islamic regime. They simply blamed and his officials.
Well, at that point, we come to an end of the program. Thanks to our guests. In Tehran, Sadegh Zibakalam. In Washington, D.C., Hillary Mann Leverett. And in Dubai, Peter Middlebrook. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.
Alternative angle, a fresh approach. We bring you the people experiencing what's really happening on the ground, those living the stories that we uncover with the help of the online community. It's your show, online and on air. So get involved. Join the stream at this time on Al Jazeera.
December 1989, Romanian President Nicolae Ceausescu was executed. Revolution deposed tyranny. A new government promised a better future, but more than 2